Hi, this is Asa, here to take a look at Forza Horizon 5. Playground Games have been bringing their top-tier open-world visuals and performance with the Forza Horizon series for years, with the technology and support of the Forza Motorsport studio Turn 10. This fifth iteration shows up masterfully across the board on hardware ranging from the base Xbox One right through to the Series X and a near infinite range of PC configurations. In this video I take a look at all of the Xbox versions and profiles, as well as the good, the bad and the ugly of the top-end PC performance. Stick around for the end of the video as well, as we take a little look at how Forza Horizon 5 stacks up against its biggest rival in the space, Forza Horizon 4. As always, this Technalysis video is meant for your eyes as well as your ears, and you can watch it in full 4K with high dynamic range to see all of the detail for yourself. Buckle up and we'll get started. I'll jump straight in on one of the hottest talking points, the performance and quality profiles on the Xbox Series consoles, and which one you should choose to play the game. On the Xbox Series X, the quality mode cranks up the graphics settings to what looks pretty close to the Ultra profile on the PC. It runs at native 4K, and while dynamic scaling is in place, I'd be hard pressed to point out any dips in resolution. Forza Horizon's dynamic scaling is really sophisticated and extends beyond simply scaling the resolution. It's able to tweak and reduce a wide range of visual features on the fly to maintain its performance. The scaling is timed to perfection and performance rarely skips a beat on any console. But my point here is just that you shouldn't focus on pixel counts too much as we go through this video. The one drawback to quality mode on the Series X is of course a significant one. It runs at 30 frames per second. The performance mode locks in 60 frames per second. It also runs at 4K resolution, but compromises visual settings with lower quality screen space reflections, less dense foliage, and reduced distances for level of detail and ambient occlusion. The dynamic scaling kicks in a bit more often and a bit more aggressively, and in VG Technalysis they counted resolution as low as 1600p, but I didn't find the scaling to be intrusive. Overall, I'd say the most noticeable compromise to achieve 60 frames per second as far as my eyes are concerned is more of an appearance of detail pop-in on the cacti, bushes and other objects that populate the world. Every other cutback in performance mode fades out of mind while playing, but seeing incidental scenery transition from a vague silhouette to a lit and detailed object is fairly noticeable in play. The Series S tells a roughly similar story. The quality mode runs at 30 frames per second and 1440p resolution, scaling down to a lower boundary of about 1080p. The visual settings and textures don't reach the same level as the Series X, but we'll take a closer look at that a bit later. The performance mode on the Series S again delivers a rock-solid 60 frames per second, but the peak resolution is a more modest 1080p and is a noticeable hit to the effects and the environmental detail. In terms of the gameplay and responsiveness, the difference between the two modes is honestly negligible. You're throwing weighty hunks of metal around and they're not supposed to alter course instantly. Don't get me wrong here, the driving feels great, but steering cars is not the same as flicking a reticule from point to point. And if you can feel a 16 millisecond difference in input response here, it's probably a placebo effect. You don't really need to concern yourself with getting a competitive edge, so just give your eyes the biggest visual treat. So with that in mind, I can tell you clearly that the mode that you should use depends. I'm not trying to cop out here, but your eyes are not my eyes. Your brain does not interpret motion in exactly the same way as everybody else, and you need to pick the mode that looks best to you. When I play the footage side by side, the frame rate difference is probably very apparent. I mean, if you really can't tell the difference when seeing it side by side, quality mode is definitely right for you. But for everyone that can tell the difference, forget you've seen it. You won't be playing the game with a side-by-side comparison that prevents you from adjusting to the motion. Here's how I actually recommend you choose between the two modes. When you start the game, it drops you straight into the driver's seat for an intro sequence, and on both the series consoles, you start out with the 30 frames per second mode. Just play it a bit. If the motion looks good to you, keep playing and never look back. If it looks all choppy, then dip into the options and choose the performance mode. I use performance mode on the console, and I suspect the majority of people that are actually aware of these settings will end up on performance mode. But if you're happy with quality mode, then don't let anyone tell you that you're doing it wrong. Right, let's step back from the luxury of choice on the series consoles and take a little look at what Playground Games have delivered across the range of hardware. First up is the humble Xbox One. More specifically, this footage is taken from the Xbox One S, so it does support HDR, but the performance profile is otherwise a match for the big old Xbox One. Unsurprisingly, the graphics are toned down in just about every area, and there's no option for 60 frames per second here. But even so, the game is an impressive showpiece for the aging hardware. It targets 1080p and 30 frames per second, with dynamic resolution scaling kicking in fairly frequently, but thanks to the quite unique rendering pipeline in the Forza Tech engine, Playground maintained 4 times multi-sampling anti-aliasing, which is a small miracle as far as Xbox One games go. MSAA is usually a pretty resource-heavy approach to smoothing off jagged lines before a final render, so unlike post-processing techniques, it cleans up those lines without compromising the sharpness. Before I get into comparisons with other versions of the game, I just want to take a minute to point out some of the beautiful dynamic lighting and atmospheric conditions in this time-lapse. See how dramatically the lighting changes as the sun shifts, how cloud cover varies, and those meticulously lifelike clouds cast shadows all over the environment? How sandstorms come and go? All of this is stunning to behold, but it also makes direct comparisons a pain in the butt. Just bear that in mind when looking at things side by side, as some of the most dramatic differences are caused by changes in the position of the sun and the clouds, rather than the teraflops and the gigahertz. Okay, so comparing the Xbox One version to the Xbox Series X version shows a fairly dramatic difference, as you'd expect. The one has significantly reduced object density and world detail, with some fairly smudgy textures. It's fair to say that every visual setting conceivable is significantly reduced, but still, the Xbox One version retains so much. Screen space reflections still do the business, the world is still dynamically lit, surfaces deform, and the cars are beautifully represented and critically fun to drive. All that at a pretty rock solid 30 frames per second is a minor miracle as far as this hardware is concerned. Of course, for the sophisticated Xbox One owner that simply can't be doing with these compromises, Microsoft's cloud streaming might provide a solution. This option essentially lets you stream the full Series X version of the game from the cloud. You're limited to 1080p and you do lose out on high dynamic range, which is definitely missed, but those high-end visual settings, reduced load times, and even 60 frames per second are there for the taking. It's hard for me to just ignore the compression artifacts on a big screen, but it's also a really great option for a phone or a tablet. The Xbox One X comes in with a 4K resolution and crisp, impressive textures. The console designed to deliver Xbox One games to ultra-high definition displays once again offers so much more than a higher resolution over and above the Xbox One S. This is a visually rich experience. There's just the one profile on offer here, and it runs at 4K with dynamic scaling, of course, and 30 frames per second, hitting that 30 frames per second target pretty much flawlessly. When you hold it up side by side with the quality mode of the Xbox Series X, you can quite clearly see the difference in the world density and lighting, and I did run up against 1 or 2 minor hitches when hitting top speeds around the open world, but those were few and far between and definitely didn't occur in races. I touched on the Xbox Series S when looking at the performance profiles earlier, and it's worth mentioning next to the older One X as well. The One X beats out the Series S quality mode on a 4K display, but it should be pretty well established by now that the Series S doesn't aim to hit that 4K enthusiast audience. The Series S version of the game offers remarkable presentation for the mainstream gamer, with snappy load times and the option for a smooth 60 frames per second gameplay. It's definitely my preferred version of the two if I want to actually get on and play. Playground Games have totally overhauled the audio, and they've said they're using the dedicated audio hardware in the Series consoles to use ray tracing to accurately reverberate sound around the environment. It's a massive improvement. Take a listen to the audio in Forza Horizon 4. And now the same car in Forza Horizon 5. It's a night and day difference, but what about the Xbox One generation that doesn't offer that ray traced audio? Take a listen to the One X. Let's have a brief look at the PC version. I don't have a wide range of PC hardware to test here, so I'm specifically looking at just how impressive Forza Horizon 5 can be at the top of the hardware pile. I said at the start that I'd look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, so I'll get the ugly out of the way. Nothing about Forza Horizon 5 is ugly. Maybe me as the player, but not the game. The bad? I have one criticism of the PC version, and it's certainly not a deal breaker, but it doesn't really push beyond the console version. It seems that the goal is to provide a fantastic console port rather than really leverage the unique advantages of the PC platform. They achieved that with aplomb, but the peak settings leave plenty of headroom for more. It would have been wonderful to see ray-traced global illumination or reflections that improve the in-car mirrors. I can only dream of how incredible this game would be in virtual reality. It's such an obvious fit, but it seems I'll have to stay in the real world for a while yet. Still, things could be a lot worse. A good console port is not something that a PC player can take for granted, so I'm happy to say that the game runs beautifully. It looks drop dead gorgeous, and it's great fun. Based on the console versions, I expect it scales really well across a range of PC hardware as well. Finally, let's take a look at how Forza Horizon 5 stacks up against its closest rival, Forza Horizon 4. It's an interesting comparison because Forza Horizon 4 was also optimized for the Series X to offer 60 frames per second, and there were some minor trade-offs in the night racing that suggested it was pushing against the limits of that console. So can Forza Horizon 5 offer much improvement when it's built on the same version of the Forza tech engine with the same cross-gen foundation? The answer is a quite resounding yes. The two games do have a lot in common, but Forza Horizon 5 excels in some key areas. The photogrammetry techniques yield significant improvements to the up texture quality. The lighting is a big step up, and shadows are much improved as well, and of course the audio was already mentioned. More subjectively, Mexico offers a little je ne sais quoi. It's just nicer to look at than England. Maybe that's more to do with where I live than any real difference, I don't know, but it looks great. Anyway, that's my overview of every version of Forza Horizon 5. It's a hugely impressive game and there's loads to talk about, so if you want to see any versions or details explored more thoroughly, then leave a comment and I may just cover it off in another video. You can also check out Gaz's impressions of the game to find out if he thinks it's any good. If you've enjoyed this at all, then please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know what game you'd like to see covered next. Enjoy your gaming.